Thanks for watching our second video in the New Testament in Ordinary Times series. This week we'll pay close attention to Paul's letter to the Galatians to see how this letter, one of the earliest writings of the New Testament, was radically innovative. Here, Paul declares his title as Apostle to the Gentiles. Paul's calling to the Gentiles put him at odds not only with traditional Judaism, but also with others who were a part of the Jesus movement that later became Christianity. Paul's innovation regarding how Gentiles were incorporated into the early Jesus movement was opposed by others and other Christian leaders who challenged Paul directly. We see this challenge in the letter to the Galatians in the form of the men from James who confronted Paul's innovation with their traditional views about how Gentiles were supposed to follow the law, the Torah. Innovation, Paul's innovation. Paul's primary innovation, specifically in the letter to the Galatians, is his insistence on the fact that Gentiles did not have to follow the guidelines in the Bible that determined how someone entered into covenant with God. In particular, Paul said Gentiles did not have to be circumcised to be followers of Jesus. This was radical, and this was radical because the Jesus movement was a Jewish movement at this early stage of Christianity. To become a Christian was, in fact, to become a particular kind of Jew, a Jew who believed that Jesus was the promised Messiah. Paul argues in Galatians that Gentiles are free from the law and only need to believe in Jesus or have the same faith that Jesus had. So, how did Paul arrive at such a notion? Who is Paul of Tarsus? Attention to who this guy is. Our primary resources for understanding Paul is his letters and the other writings that speak about him in the New Testament, and most importantly, the Acts of the Apostles, or just called Acts. Almost half of that entire book is devoted to Paul's ministry. In his letters, Paul gives several autobiographical statements that are important for us to understand Paul. Galatians in particular, we find a very long segment of autobiographical content that relates Paul's initial call all the way to his disagreement with Peter at Antioch nearly 2 decades later. This extended autobiography shows Paul's own rationale for his innovation and how this caused severe disagreement with Peter and other major leaders of the early Jewish Jesus movement, particularly James. We don't have time during this short video to detail this encounter, so I encourage you to spend some time reading through this section of Galatians, specifically Galatians chapter 1, verse 13 through chapter 2, verse 16. Other autobiographical statements from Paul are found in Philippians 3, 5 through 6, where he says he's circumcised on the 8th day, a member of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness in the law, blameless. So here Paul gives his pedigree, but then he says he would that's all nothing to him now. So he talks about who he is in his his Jewishness. 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 11 also describe where he thinks he fits in the line of all these apostles and how Christ was revealed to him. Verses 7 through 9 in particular, he says, "Last of all, as to one untimely born, he, Jesus, appeared also to me, for I am the least of the apostles, because I persecuted the church of God." And then finally in Romans 1 through 5, which will be important to us later, he talks specifically about being called to Gentiles to bring about the obedience of faith among the Gentiles. All these are Paul talking about himself. The other places we find Paul, biographical information about Paul is specifically in Acts. Acts provides biographical material about Paul, but reader beware. Luke, the author of Acts, seems to be a traveling companion with Paul during some of his missionary journeys. But Luke's writings are not Paul's own words. There are some major discrepancies between Acts and Paul's own writings regarding important events in Paul's life, specifically Paul's encounter with the leaders of the Jerusalem church. In our own time, in your own time, pay close attention between the differences between this account in Galatians in the Jerusalem church and in Acts chapter 15 and Acts chapter 21. Paul's own understanding of this encounter is pretty different than what we find in Acts 15 and Acts 21. Luke's picture of Paul is somewhat mediated and much less aggressive with the acknowledged leaders of the Jesus movement in Jerusalem. Luke clearly acknowledges the superiority of the Jerusalem leaders of the Jesus movement over Paul, while Paul doesn't give them or tries not to give them that much authority in Galatians. In Acts, Paul does what they tell him to do. In Galatians, Paul does what he wants to do, and these leaders simply agree with him. So this week, when you have time, look at Acts chapter 7, verses 58 through 8:3. This is where Saul, who becomes Paul, initially comes onto the scene in the narrative of Acts. And there he is persecuting the Jerusalem church. He's there at an early Christian leader named Stephen. Saul watches him being stoned to death and approves of it. And then it looks like he begins to persecute the church at Jerusalem, which would have included Peter and James and John, who he will encounter later disagreeing about how to be a follower of Jesus. And then in Acts chapter 9, verses 1 through 31, that's the first time Acts tells the story of Paul's calling or Paul's vision of the resurrected Christ. And that event is so important in Acts that Luke retells that story two other times in chapter 22, verses 1 through 21, and 26, 2 through 23. So that Paul's calling to the Gentiles, or Paul's vision of the resurrected Christ, is incredibly important in Acts. And it's also important to him because he talks about it in Galatians. In Acts chapter 13, verses 1 and following, you get Saul and Barnabas. Saul, later called Paul, commissioned by the church in Antioch. The church there in Antioch is a very important church in early Christianity. The Jerusalem church was probably the most important. The church at Antioch was probably the second most important church in early Christianity. They commissioned Paul and Barnabas as missionaries. That's where Peter and Paul get into an argument, according to Galatians. It's a launching pad for a lot of early Christianity. So Acts chapter 15 and chapter 21, like I've said, this tells about Paul's encounter with the leaders of the Jerusalem church. And then in Acts chapter 16, verses 37 and 25 through 29, this is where Paul declares that he is a Roman citizen. Now, this only happens in Acts. In none of Paul's letters does he say that he's a Roman citizen, but Acts says that he is. So it's important to note that that is what Luke says about Paul. It's not what Paul says about himself in his own letters. Again, who is this Paul of Tarsus? So we've heard something about him from himself. We heard something about him from Luke in Acts. But who is this Paul of Tarsus? What is not specifically important from these biblical passages is the difference between Judaism in the homeland of Judea and Judaism outside of Judea. Jews and Judeans who did not live in the homeland were understood as living in the diaspora or the dispersion. These are Jews literally scattered throughout the world. And it is abundantly clear in Acts that Paul is a diaspora Jew who would have grown up in a Gentile world surrounded by Gentile images and architecture. It's actually in the book of Acts that we hear that Paul is from Tarsus. Paul never says that about himself in his own letters. Luke is the one who tells us about that. Paul growing up in the diaspora, Paul's daily interaction with Gentiles in the diaspora would have been a constitutive part of his life. And so his capacity in the diaspora to accommodate Gentile customs may have been a much higher capacity than Jews living in the homeland, specifically Jews like James, Peter, and John. The Judean province of Rome was boiling over in political turmoil during this time period, and Paul was a part of it, according to Acts, when he tried to squash the church there. So the Jesus movement was a movement within Judaism. It was contentious movement in what was a contentious time period in the Roman world, specifically in Judea. So Paul was a part of that, and later he would have to answer to these same leaders for his innovative thoughts about the Jesus movement. Paul's major innovation was his belief that Gentiles did not have to comply with the religious rituals found in the Bible. So, Gentile inclusion. In his salutations to both the Galatians and Romans, Paul specifically calls himself an apostle to the Gentiles. The word apostle simply means one who is sent. Paul understood himself as someone sent by God to the Gentiles with the message of Jesus Christ. His calling was to convince Gentiles of Jesus' role in their transformation. This entailed them becoming part of the Jewish Jesus movement. But for Paul, it was without the religious requirements of circumcision and other rituals. Since Paul's letters predate Acts, it was Paul who was the first person to ever do this. To include Gentiles without Jewish rites. This was his own innovation, and he understood it as a calling from God. While Acts says that Peter's vision of God telling him to eat unclean animals was the first instance of Gentile inclusion without Jewish religious rituals, that story comes decades after Paul's ministry to the Gentiles. Acts merely mediates this major innovation in Judaism. Paul was literally the first of his kind. And Galatians 6:15 sums up his innovation best. It says, "For neither circumcision nor uncircumcision is anything, but a new creation is everything." This new creation is a revolutionary innovation in the early Jesus movement. It is this innovation that would set the precedent for the Jesus movement to become something other than a Jewish movement. The churches of Galatia. The letter to the Galatians was written to several churches in the area specified by this map. So it was intentionally written to be circulated among these churches. It was in this Gentile area that Paul demands their allegiance and calls them to refuse circumcision. They refuse observance of holidays and other Jewish rituals. This only indicates that these churches were siding with a more traditional view of the Judaism of the early Jesus movement. If they were doing exactly what Paul wanted, then we may never have had this letter in the first place. It was their disregard for Paul, much like the disregard Paul experienced in Antioch, that called for such a forceful letter. In other words, Paul may not have had as much authority as his letters indicate. In many of Paul's letters, he has to exert authority, which is always an indication that his authority was in doubt. let me repeat that. The letter to the Galatians, in many of Paul's letters, he has to exert authority, which is always an indication that his authority was in doubt. Real authority is assumed rather than exerted. An example of assumed authority is the letter of James, who never states his credentials or his pedigree, and he never attempts to win consent. He takes his authority for granted. Paul's effective use of biblical interpretation, however, was clever, in spite of the fact that it looks like he didn't enjoy as much authority as his letters may assume. He really is an incredible biblical interpreter. And he uses Abraham as his scriptural reference for his radically innovative theology. Paul uses the Abraham story in Galatians and Romans to argue that Gentiles do not have to submit to religious rituals like circumcision. In Galatians chapter 3 through 4, Paul argues that Abraham was made righteous by God because of Abraham's faith. By referencing Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, Paul uses Abraham as the champion of faith. James, on the other hand, James's use of this same passage from Genesis is just the opposite of Paul. James uses this same passage to argue that Abraham was made righteous through his works. And this highlights the contrast and the conflict between James and Paul. These two early Jesus followers, who both became giants of early Christianity, fundamentally disagreed about what constituted Christian identity. James argued for a more traditional and purist identity. Paul argued for a more innovative and hybrid identity. So, what is authentic Christian identity? This clash of titans was important for the early Christian movement. It shows us that there was a serious conflict about what represented authentic Christian identity. This ancient conflict can be instructive for our modern movement. The fact that the conflict was preserved in our Bible tells us that both voices, if not all voices, are important. Since both Paul and James are in our New Testament, we don't have as much of an answer as we do a model for discussing what constitutes authentic Christian identity for today. Do we hold on to tradition, or do we follow innovation? I think the answer is yes. We are not unlike James and Paul when we navigate and negotiate our identity in the modern world. Our old traditions help us as we move through the newness of cultural evolution and innovation. This is never a static process. As is evidenced from James and Paul, it never has been. The onus is always on us.